Well, Tony, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Duke.
And this is a timely conversation we're going to have. We're in the midst of an election campaign, as you well know, and relationships between our country and Mexico are showing up frequently in debates. So we look forward to getting your insights as to where that relationship is and where it could be going. But first of all, tell me a little bit more about your Center for the U.S. and Mexico at the Baker Institute at Rice University, a place I know well and like very much. You're the director of the Institute. Tell me more about the work.
Yeah, 13 years ago, I was invited to the Baker Institute to work on a particular project on immigration. It was a project that was supposed to last 6 months. That was
So,
almost
so,
13
so
years
you're
ago.
slow. You're slow at getting your work done.
Yeah, that's right. But at that time, I think Erica de la Garza, who then led the Latin America Initiative, and I thought about the idea of a Mexico Center. We thought that Mexico is such an important relationship for the United States. I don't think that there is any other country that has the same kind of impact on so many millions of Americans as Mexico. For good and bad. I mean, there's obviously investment, Americans living in Mexico, Mexican immigration in the United States, trade, fentanyl, investment, the border infrastructure. I mean, you name it. Lots of Americans obviously are involved in this relationship, millions and millions of them, and obviously also in Mexico. And I think it really requires special attention. Sure, I think Russia matters, China matters, Europe matters, but Mexico is right here. And so we proposed the idea of the creation of a Mexico Center, and the board of advisors said yes. And so since then, we spent 24/7 looking at all these different issues between the two countries here at Rice.
I think you are absolutely right, and thus the point of this discussion that we're having here. It is important that people understand Mexico in a more nuanced way than it's presented frequently in the press or by virtue of whatever means that people get their information. Obviously, that portrait of Mexico and our relationship can be rather one-sided at times. But it is a complex and comprehensive relationship. So you wrote a report recently, The Outlook for 2024, about the circumstances as you see them within Mexico. And like the relationship itself, it paints a complicated picture. You speak a lot about government, maybe where it's going to have some challenges or might be moving in a direction that you think could be less than optimal. But on the other hand, there are great opportunities for our respective economies and what we share as well. Challenges around the environment. But it's a complex picture that you paint. Tell us a bit more about that perspective that you offer in that report.
Yeah, in 2019, some colleagues and I decided, hey, is there a Mexico country outlook on an annual basis that can tell Americans in businesses, folks that travel to Mexico, people that are interested in Mexico, the general public, academics, that can tell them what is going on in Mexico in the following year. So the report that you're reading was published in December of 2023, and it is the MCO 2024, the Mexico Country Outlook 2024. In fact, we're already preparing the Mexico Country Outlook 2025. And what we try to do is essentially to look at Mexico, what's coming up politically. There was an important election in June in Mexico. We know what the results were. What's coming up regulatorily for businesses? What do they have to consider when it comes to Mexico? What's coming up on security? What's coming up on health, public health? What's coming up on education, on infrastructure, on fiscal policy, on, of course, security, which is of extreme importance to Americans, immigration, fentanyl, the border. And so in this particular report, we cover the entire gamut. I think it's a very unique product in the sense that you often have consultancies or specific universities or specific journals that produce, Mexico's fiscal outlook, Mexico's security outlook. This is the first document that really looks at the entire relationship every single year. And let me tell you, our outlook in December 2023 for this year wasn't very optimistic. We thought that there's that things in Mexico are not going well. They're not going right. Fiscal policy is getting tighter. Debt is going up. There's a huge budget deficit, 6% budget deficit, which I think is quite unacceptable. There is a lot of security deterioration with organized crime in many different states, in Chiapas, in Sinaloa, in Guerrero, in Michoacan, in many different places, Zacatecas certainly. And then there is, of course, the restoration of a political monopoly in the hands of Morena. Lopez Obrador has been very astute and
Hmm.
very good at working out his political pieces and sort of reinstalling a one party rule so far. We don't know how long it will last, but it's there. And of course, the uncertainty of the USMCA and the renegotiation that's coming up in 2026. We had also had a border crisis.
Right.
So you name it. I mean, there was it wasn't very optimistic, but I think as of right now, September 2024, we're yet to be proven wrong. And I think 2025 is looking like a very complicated year as well.
Well, that's what struck me. You say some things in the report that are pretty blunt and, as you point out, maybe less than optimistic. Yet, the U.S. and Mexico, side by side, we have to have a good relationship. Some good things have to happen in Mexico for that to be the case. You attribute a lot, as you were just mentioning, to governmental decisions, particularly at the top, that you see at the source of a number of these problems. And now, with Moreno likely going to be in power for quite some time, that is a different circumstance. How much do you attribute the turbulence in the government to the turbulence that we have in this country? When people view the United States, which has always been a rock of democracy and other things, when we're having our own challenges and elections like they were in Mexico being challenged, how much of an echo is there in Mexico of what they're observing, Mexicans are observing in our country?
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you, most of Mexico's wounds are self-inflicted.
Mm,
They have to do with bad policy, much
mm,
like in the United States, I guess. Many of us know very well that our politicians, our political class is not up to par. Same thing in Mexico. I think they make decisions that are very poor for most people. And I think in the case of Mexico, that is the case, except that I would say that there is another layer, another level above that. And that layer has a lot to do with the fact that times have changed.
mm,
If you look at the 21st century, the Bush administration back in 2001 was supposed to pay a lot of attention to Mexico. He was a Texan governor in the 1990s, and he was very well acquainted with Mexico and the border. It was supposed to be the era of Latin America in American foreign policy. But then September 11th showed up. And
mm,
then we spent the next few years occupied in the Middle East, neglecting the relationship with Mexico. Obviously, Mexico quite polarized at that time under the Calderon administration, trying to face organized crime with a number of security issues growing. Even though the economic relationship was bustling and is really very strong even to this day, but some
mhm,
things were not right. And then in 2008, 2009, we had the huge financial crisis, which set us into a tailspin of doubt about trade and liberalism and the benefits of trade. And
mm,
that is the case on both sides of the border.
right.
Mexicans began to have a lot of doubts about the relationship with the United States, about trade with the United States, about the intentions of investment in Mexico. And of course, Americans began to sort of feel considerably more isolationist and begin to question the issues. That ended up with Trump's election in 2016. And here we are 8 years later with the USMCA, which was renegotiated between 17 and 20, hanging from a thread. In fact, one of our speakers this week in an event made the statement that the 2026 review and revision of the USMCA is not guaranteed, that there's no
Right.
incentive to do it. In fact, they got to all the way down to 2036 to do it, so they don't have to do it next year.
Right.
The trade agreement doesn't expire immediately, so very complicated. I think there's something in the air. It's a new environment. It's a new world. It's a new zeitgeist, so to speak. It's a new rarefied environment that we're living in. And I think you're absolutely right. It's like the sound waves go south of the border and then they return back up. And we're certainly in the middle of huge doubts about each other. And that complicates what politicians and policymakers can do and what we can do.
Let's talk about the USMCA, the U.S. Mexico Canada trade agreement, since you just brought it up. And at the time that it was passed, people discovered there was this review in 2026, which is unusual for agreements like that, which tend to persist longer. And essentially, you set them in motion, and unless there's a problem, they would persist in perpetuity. But this one had let's double check everything 10 years after it was signed, approximately, which puts into, as you point out, doubt. Hey, if I'm going to make business decisions, if I'm thinking about corporations moving money one side of the border or the other, doing things, I'd like to have a sense that there's going to be a continuation of what I'm betting on. Tell us about the USMCA and that need to have a review. And as you point out, people's concern about that.
Well, you may remember that in 2016, I think during the campaign, Trump made Mexico, the border, immigration, kind of a centerpiece of his campaign.
Yes,
He got
I think we all recall that vividly.
Yeah, he certainly rode that into victory in November of 2016. And of course, one of the things that he said was that the
Hmm.
NAFTA then
Hmm.
it was called NAFTA to the USMCA was he said the worst agreement we ever signed. So that in and of itself, I think, put Canada and Mexico on the defensive. And certainly there was a lot of uncertainty. And I think renegotiations of NAFTA began in earnest in August of 2017, just months
Hmm.
after Trump took office in January 2017. Those renegotiations went through all the way to, I think, July 1st, 2020, when the new version of NAFTA went into force. Now, what was motivating, I think, Trump's renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement? Serious doubts about the benefits of trade, a more
Hmm.
nationalistic outlook of the American economy, which was then worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic, which essentially revealed some serious weaknesses in the supply chains, the global supply chains. We were too
Hmm.
dependent on other countries for certain goods, certain supply chains, not the least of which was, of course, chips or
Hmm.
microprocessors. So that came into play, and the Trump administration said, "Look, we're gonna renegotiate NAFTA, but we're gonna insert this sunset clause, and in it, there's going to be the agreement will be in force 16 years, but on the sixth year, which is 2026, we will have to review and revise it. Of course, one thing is to review, check, 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 check,
Hmm.
everything is working, looks good. A different thing is to
Right.
revise it. If it is opened again, then we have a
Right.
problem because it's going to have to go through all the lobbying and all the unions, and it's going to have to go through the Mexican Senate again and the U.S. Senate. It's going to be a whole process, and we don't know
Hmm.
where that may end up. It's going to be a very difficult thing. Now, in Mexico, along with that, and the Lopez Obrador administration, he got elected in 2018. There were also very serious doubts about the benefits of open free trade. He certainly closed the energy sector again against the wishes of the United States to allow investment in that sector. He certainly put in doubt a lot of the mining investments by Canada in Mexico because this is we're talking about
Right.
resource nationalism. Mexico paranoid that the country's resources were being exfoliated by the U.S. and by Canada and taken away, the kind of natural wealth. And then, of course, the Mexican government created the
Hmm.
lithium company to ensure that lithium was not being exploited for things that the United States
Right.
needs in batteries and the new EV era and things like that. So clearly, we're in a time where both countries are having a lot of doubts about the relationship. They're happy with trade. They're happy that this trade is occurring. I don't think it's going to go back. But this agreement certainly says we don't trust each other anymore. We're not cooperating
Mm,
each other anymore. We don't, and of course that extends to security. There's almost no security cooperation, and so we are at a time in which we need to understand very carefully what are not just the down into the weeds issues that we have conflict on or non-cooperation on. It's like a
right.
general malaise in the binational relationship. The trust that was built over the 1990s is gone. We have to figure out how to replenish that so that we can then begin to more easily deal with the day-to-day issues that we have.
Well, my personal observation obviously would be when characterizations of who the other side is, if you want to put it that way, come through our political dialogue and certain media channels and whatever, that's hugely powerful. And for some people, that is the only message they hear, a more nuanced discussion about who we really are, again, on both sides, what we can be. It's hard to overcome that media drumbeat. So I think it's not, the relationship is definitely impacted or inflected by what people are hearing and how they're hearing that. But as you point out, globalization, internationalization, trade that crosses borders also plays into our relationship with China. And that has been complicated of late. And people have been celebrating nearshoring, things coming to at least this continent. And maybe they're manufactured in Mexico, maybe in the United States, but that trade seems to be more viable in some respects. Tell us about the relationship with China and nearshoring, and thus the economic, if not the environmental impacts of seeing a manufacturing base expand in Mexico.
Yeah. Well, nearshoring is one of those controversial things. It's obviously a buzzword. Everybody talks
Mm-hmm.
about nearshoring. Everybody talks about this new geostrategic competition between the United States and China, and the need to return some of those supply chains that I mentioned back from Asia into North America. Not everything can be produced back in the United States. Our labor is very expensive. Our processes are very complicated. So Mexico constitutes, paradoxically, a very important piece of this more nationalistic strategy of the United States, which, by the way, is shared by both Trump and the Biden administration. And I don't think that if Trump comes back or we have a Harris administration is going to change. We're simply in a more protectionist mood
Yeah.
in the United States. We are a lot more suspicious about what's going on in the world. We have this isolationist impulse. So this is about gathering our supply chains back into North America as best as we can. And then this is all happening not in the 1990s where Mexico was open for business, ready to work with the United States, lots of trust, lots of new ways of cooperating, but rather at a time of where mutual distrust is growing, where there's all kinds of doubts about each other. Mhm.
Do you just why you mentioned using those words, that vocabulary, there's more distrust with regard to either administration that might be in office come next year. Do you think that's, if you will, justified based on how we now have come to understand how business is done in China, so to speak, technology that was acquired, maybe not through the most open-ended, transparent means? Would you say that mistrust or at least concern is justified?
I would say that not altogether. There's obviously some concerns about China's advantages and China's subsidies of its microprocessors industry, of its e-vehicles. I mean, think about the fact that in 2006, China exported 500,000 vehicles, and now it
Right.
exports 6.5 million. Think about the fact that China does have an industrial policy that has been very specifically dedicated to place China up on top of the world. And of
Yes.
course, they have this huge plan about being the number one, the top dog by 2049, which is 100 years from the 1949 takeover of the Communist Party. So their plan is very clear, and I think there is an increasing paranoia in the United States. Is everything that China does a threat to the United States? Not necessarily. Uh, I mean, they can do, I guess, furniture and plasticware and things like that. They're not a threat to the United States. We probably can't even build those things or
Hmm.
manufacture those things competitively. But there is some concern about technology, about the internet, about AI, about e-vehicles, because that's an important industry for us and for them, for Europe too. And Mexico is kind of this important component. What we are listening or hearing about now is the fact that the Chinese appear to be ramping up their investment in Mexico. And what kind of investment is that going to
Hmm.
be? Is it
Hmm.
going to be EVs? Is it going to be packaging of microprocessors or chips
Hmm.
and things like
Hmm.
that? Will that pose a threat to the U.S. industry? Possibly, but not everything poses a threat. In many ways,
Hmm.
this is a little bit exaggerated because I think our political class is very bent on having this kind of paranoia. It's partly a choice. I think not everything is a threat, but we just saw that the U.S. is now saying that Mexico must not be used as a trampoline for the Chinese to use Mexico to
Right.
maintain their access to the American market. And of course, now we are not going to allow certain Chinese products like EVs and things made in Mexico, steel and aluminum and certain other products to enter the United States, no matter what happens with the USMCA or whether
Mm.
it violates the USMCA or not. So now we have to think about the triangle. We have to think about
Right.
the U.S. concerns, we have to think about China's strategy, and we have to think about Mexico as a strategic piece between them two. So yeah, I suspect that in the next few years things are going to get even more interesting. But I would caution our political class. Not everything that China does globally or in Mexico is a threat to the U.S. We just have to be selective about what we're talking and thinking about.
So, a bridge in this discussion could be energy and alternative energy, and if you will, solar panels, which are being massively produced in China. And there's concern about that, like there are with EVs, flooding the market and thus making it difficult to fabricate those here and elsewhere. So, Mexico is affiliated with energy in so many different ways. Uh, you now have a president who has a PhD in energy engineering, probably understands it's better than most in the political class. Talk to us about where energy has been in Mexico and is going, and its support, I think, of the last administration for the fossil fuel industry, but also a hope that they can make a transition as well. But it seems to be less than obvious that there's a great push for that in Mexico. So, could you speak
Well,
to that a little bit?
let me state the obvious. I don't think that the fact that Claudia Sheinbaum, the president-elect who will take office on October 1st, is going to be a whole lot different than Lopez Obrador.
Okay.
I don't give her the benefit of the doubt. I think that I never gave it to Mr. Lopez Obrador either. It's not,
Hmm.
it has nothing to do with it. It's just the fact that we've learned to read what they say. We've learned to
Hmm.
read the intertext, subtext, side text, back text, whatever you want to call it. I think we've learned how to, what they're saying and where they're going, and we watch what their hands are doing, not what their mouths are saying. And I think in the case of Mexico, she will pursue many of the same policies. What are these? One, little to no foreign or private investment in the energy sector.
Hmm.
And I think she will continue that policy. What that means is that Mexico is recarbonizing its energy sector. And what that means is that one of the most important economies in the world, Mexico, 13th or 14th in the world, is essentially absent from the forums where energy transition and sustainability is being discussed. Mexico
Hmm.
doesn't have a chair at that table. So I don't think that she's going to go back. I think there's a strong resource nationalism. She's going to try to maintain that, which means that she's going to get CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission, essentially the power utility, to be the one to produce just about all electricity and transmit all electricity. So I don't see that she's going to change that policy. She may have to, by the way, eventually, because Mexico is already having to do blackouts and and
Right.
brownouts and rolling blackouts and things like that, because there's just, last year demand for power grew by 3.6% and generation by 1%. So Mexico is falling further and further behind in its ability to supply the very electricity that it needs. When it comes to gas from Texas, Mexico imports 65-70% of all its natural gas. which clearly powers its electricity generation, but also, and more importantly, its manufacturing. So Mexico is completely dependent on Texas gas, natural gas. Why? Because Mexico doesn't have the money to, but it doesn't allow private and foreign investors either to invest in the tapping into its gas reserves, which are substantial, but it doesn't want that. And then the other thing that I think it's important is Pemex, which is the oil company,
Right.
is now producing less oil than it was producing 6 years ago, about 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. And so that's compared to about 1.65 million about 6 years ago. And very importantly, I think it is the most indebted oil company at a time when most oil companies in the world, both public and private, are having record profits, tens of billions of dollars. Pemex has an incredible debt of 100 to 110 billion dollars, heavily indebted, heavily inefficient, not investing in new exploration, not investing in new technology. I mean, it's a company that's in shambles. So to me, for Scheinbaum to turn that around, the entire energy sector, get Mexico back at the table of sustainability and climate change and energy transition, and to get Mexico's own energy sector back up to speed is going to take more than her 6 years.
So,
So I don't see a whole lot there.
like I said in your report for 2024, there was not a lot of optimism, and this is one of the cases in point. And it's also fascinating to hear you say, "Yeah, I see the credentials. I see the fact that she was, worked at the Lawrence Livermore laboratory here and other places." But that's not an indicator of where she'll take policy or not move it from where it currently is. But if you're short on energy and you're having blackouts and now are increasing manufacturing, surely alternative fuels would seem to be attractive. But if that can't be achieved without foreign investment or external investment, that conundrum there just seems, I don't want to say irrational. You need that investment to achieve this, to solve a number of problems. The reason not to do that would be what?
I think she will be forced to do it eventually, but she's going to resist it. And I think there's a very simple reason why. Think about Morena. I mean, I think about Clara Scheinbaum as somebody who's being corralled by the president in
Mm,
several ways. I'm
mm,
talking about President Lopez Obrador, right?
yes.
The number one thing is they just passed a number of constitutional amendments, not the least of which is judicial reform. And then the other one is, of course, the placing the National Guard under the military and giving the military policing responsibilities, including investigating crimes, which is unheard of. I mean,
Right.
this is just strange, uh, uh, and 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 I think she's going to spend. I think part of the implementation, first of all, she has to shepherd the secondary legislation after this constitutional change, because that has to be fleshed out by Congress. Number one, she's going to have to do it in two tranches, 25 and 27, which means she's going to be spending a lot of political capital just implementing these constitutional changes. Number
Mm,
two, she's going to, I think, about 7 or 8 of the 20 cabinet members are essentially people that Mr. Lopez Obrador imposed on her.
mm,
Third, I think Mr. Lopez Obrador's son is going to be the leader of the party Morena,
mm,
which means that he's going to have a direct influence on the party and Congress, because they have this enormous majority, which they were not entitled to. They got 54% of the vote, and they adjudicated for themselves 74% of the votes in Congress. And they cheated. Theirs was clearly, they cheated in the election, but they also cheated in the numbers, in the way they distributed the number of seats for themselves and their coalition. So who is the party going to be loyal to? Mr. Lopez Obrador and
mm,
his son,
mm.
or her? And then, of course, she also inherits a number of important ticking time bombs: fiscal policy, security, deteriorating infrastructure, a very still high rate of inflation, the implementation of these changes that are going to occupy much of her effort and time, the really a terrible issue with organized crime. So to me, the agenda is set for her. How much room to maneuver to build a new vision that is not Mr. Lopez Obrador's playbook will she have? I think very little. I think we're looking at a practically a second term, so to speak.
So this is pretty distressing and clearly delivered news. You're very good at that, Tony. But I appreciate that. I appreciate your perspective and calling it as you see it. And I think you're waking people up to the need to truly understand the political circumstance there, which is complex. It's very complex, and Americans are barely fully aware of everything going on in this country. To understand that is maybe a bridge too far. But I think reading the credentials of the new president, many people were optimistic that this person would bring something else to it. You mentioned also in your report, and it's related to energy, the other big topic that's existential always is water. And it's a place where the two countries have a very direct reciprocity about needing to deliver water each to the other side. In our case, from the Colorado and Rio Grande is a different circumstance. How do you think water figures into this? Because it's clearly a frontline environmental issue and one that's only becoming more severe as the temperatures continue to rise, both in your country and ours.
Well, Duke, it's partly your fault that you asked me all these questions because then I have to give you my best, most honest answer, and then I sound really pessimistic. Maybe I'll
No,
find.
no, no, no. You know what? There's nothing better than someone sharing directly what they believe that's
Yeah,
well researched. I mean, your
yeah,
observations are based on data and the research
yes.
that you do.
Yeah, you're right. There's three straddling watersheds or riversheds
Hmm.
between the two countries. The Tijuana rivershed, which is small, is just in California. That's sort of set that aside, because I think that's an important one. But the Tijuana River crosses the Baja California border. The best or the biggest is, of course, the Colorado River and the Rio
Hmm.
Grande further south in Texas. Now, in the Colorado River water basin or river basin, the United States gives Mexico water.
Right.
That water goes down to Baja California, Sonora, some places where in the Sonoran Desert to sort of supply Mexico with water in those very dry areas of northwestern Mexico, which are very, very dry, as you well know, very, very, very similar to
Comparable to where we
Arizona,
are. Yes, we know.
parts of California, and of course New Mexico and so forth. And then in the Rio Grande, which begins sort of in El Paso, but comes down from Wyoming and Colorado, New Mexico, and down to El Paso, and then it begins to become the border. Mexico has to pay the United States
Hmm.
water. So it's
Hmm.
a trade. It's a 1944 agreement that establishes this kind of trade in
Correct.
water. Now, let me tell you, every 5 years, 15, 20, 25, the total water debt has to be zeroed out.
Hmm.
Mexico had some trouble meeting its water payments to the United States in 2020. It was a very difficult place. It had to empty the dams in the state of Chihuahua and Tamaulipas, and there were a lot of riots with farmers and campesinos in Mexico because clearly they needed the water too. Texans were obviously demanding their own water. But let me tell you, if you look at the graph, over 5 years, every quinquennial, so this 5 year period, Mexico pays bit by bit, and so you can see the payment debt go, the payment, the water payments go up bit by
Hmm.
bit, year after year, and then on the fifth year, whatever the balance is paid out, and that's the end of it. Mexico is having increasing trouble paying, and every 5 years now, it has an even tougher time paying its water debt. Let me tell you, the quinquennial period that ends in 2025, October, we're about 12 months away. I've never seen it that low. I mean,
Hmm.
if you Mexico's paid about 19-20% of its total water debt in 4 years. That's a problem because it means that by October of next year, Mexico will have to have paid 80% of all the billions of cubic meters of water that it has to pay. And I don't know where the water is going to come from. I mean, it's been raining a little bit, but it's not like it's a lot of rain and a lot of water reserves. It may create a social conflict within Mexico. And one more really important thing: Texans are very upset, and they want to renegotiate that agreement because If Mexico paid 20% every year over 5 years to get to 100%, then that would allow Texan farmers and ranchers to plan their
Hmm.
crops, their cattle, things like that. When Mexico doesn't pay, and it's not technically in non-compliance because Mexico is up to 5 years to pay 100%, but then it doesn't allow Texans to plan.
I was about to say the same thing, having studied this just a little bit. Water doesn't work that way. It's not as if I can use it in a giant chunk that you suddenly give to me, assuming you had it, and I can now grow a lot of crops immediately. You need consistency, sort of like what we were talking about with the trade agreement. You want consistency and water flowing on a regular basis, which is the problem with the Colorado. It's not consistent, and it's become ever more less consistent. And that's a function of climate change and other things. So having to pay a debt based on a resource that you're not sure you're going to have, and there's not much control you have over that, and thus the social unrest that could occur, which isn't good for us either. This is a huge conundrum. So a year from now, let's say there isn't the water, even though that's an odd way to have to pay a debt in water. What do you think happens?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know. That's the number one answer. The second answer is Mexico will have to rake in, figure out a way to get all the dams emptied out from Sonora, from Chihuahua, from Coahuila, from San Luis, from Nuevo León and Tamaulipas, and just pay it out all at once. Texans are not going to be happy because all of a sudden they're going to have all this water, 80% of the
Exactly.
water they're going to have it. And what are they going to do with it? Let it flow to
Yeah.
the Gulf? I don't
Yes.
know. But clearly, Mexico will have to pay. It's always paid its water debt, but
Right.
increasingly the chunk of the payment it's towards the end of the 5 year period, and now it's unlike any other period that I've seen in recent years and recent decades. 80% of it it's still owed, and we're just a year away from the end of it. So this could create some very serious problem both in Texas, but also certainly in Mexico with all the farmers. And Mexico will just have to figure it out.
It's astonishing that this isn't a larger, a more present story. I think it's being consumed in the political debates about other things. But
Immigration, for example.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, yeah, yeah, that little issue of immigration. But just to conclude with regard to water and energy, fossil fuels versus alternatives, Mexico's orientation towards sustainability, resilience, and address to climate change, given the complex political circumstances we've just been describing, how would you position it?
Well, I think that Mexico is one of the countries that presents the greatest risk on climate change. The country is only 12% arable land.
Hmm.
So most of it is very dry. In fact, if you look at Mexico's food imports, um, most of the corn, the beans, the rice, the wheat that Mexico consumes is actually American wheat, corn, rice, beans.
Hmm.
So Mexico is heavily dependent on food imports from the United States, and not just grains, all kinds of food,
Hmm.
even chicken and
Hmm.
beef. Although obviously Mexico exports beef in Sonora, but then imports beef somewhere else
Right.
and things like that. The markets are very heavily integrated. Uh, eh, and I don't think that Mexico is going to be able to be self-sufficient as much as Mr. Lopez Obrador or maybe even Claudia Sheinbaum would want it to be. Mexico just doesn't have the water, it doesn't have the land, it doesn't have the energy to actually ensure that it produces enough food that is self-sufficient. And by the way, I think this nationalism that they kind of spouse, I think it's wrong. I mean, sure, you're dependent on the United States, but as long as you have a good trade agreement and the U.S. has a reliable crop and the farmers are willing from Ohio and Iowa and Nebraska willing to send the grain down to Mexico, what's the problem? Mexico can supply the avocados and the tomatoes and the
Right.
bananas and the pineapples and things like that. So it's complementary markets. I think this idea that no, we have to be self-sufficient, we have to produce it, this whole thing with the GMO corn, which is another issue that Mexico has put on the table, I think it's absurd, but it sort of speaks to the fact that we are really in a much more difficult environment where our politicians are going in one direction, but our needs are going in a different direction.
Hmm.
Mexico is at high risk. Most of the water in Mexico, as you well know, is in southeast Mexico,
Right.
far. I would say that from the Bahia region, Guanajuato and that kind of area in there, partly Jalisco and Querétaro and Guanajuato, and all the way to northern Mexico to the border. Mexico is really a dry country, with the one small exception, the state of Sinaloa, which is one of the bread baskets in Mexico. But that's a smallish state in northern Mexico. The rest of it, it's impossible to grow anything these days.
And then, of course, Mexico City itself, one of the largest in the world, is in one of the most dire situations with regard to water and subsidence and everything else based on its original positioning and the circumstances you're describing now. And as the capital goes, that's a real challenge for us as well. We've done a fair amount of investigations, or we've brought other people in to talk about climate migration. And what you just described, let's say emptying out all the dams, taking all the water because it's apparently owed this direction, and people become upset or they don't have the food they need or for other things, they're not going to stay there. And so the border condition is exacerbated by almost everything you've mentioned thus far to some extent. So how does that it's a terrible question to ask you. I don't know how that plays out, but the forces that cause people to want to cross the border are only going to become accelerated, it would seem. So are we aware that we're creating those situations by not having the appropriate agreements in place to lessen that push?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we've been proposing at the center is to see a more integrated labor market.
Hmm.
Look, we have a structural labor shortage in the United States.
Yes.
I think some of our chairmen of the Federal Reserve or chairpersons in the Federal Reserve have already made it very clear the U.S. doesn't have the labor market. Our demographic changes in the United States are very dramatic. We're just not going to have the labor. Mexico still has an excess labor. Still, a lot of people who could potentially benefit from coming to the United States and work. The USMCA, in its review and revision, I think could expand chapter number 16, I think, when it comes to the
Hmm.
T and visa and labor markets and things like that. And it would be one way to allow a lot of Mexicans work in the United States, take money home, help their family, develop their own small businesses, their own families, their own skills, help Mexico in some ways, give Mexico sort of some wind on the back, so to speak, on its back, so that it could move forward and at the same time sort of sustain or maintain Mexico cooperating with U.S. immigration, or at least undocumented immigration goals. There are complementary issues that we could use. It's just that we don't seem to have the political will, or even worse, the public policy creativity and ingenuity to actually marry these different interests into a single cooperative framework.
Because if we had that, also, I think what you're describing as labor could be more than just agriculture and construction and the things that sometimes either Americans don't want to do or we just have a shortage, and maybe move some of that labor, moving back and forth, into some, if you will, higher tech industries, more knowledge based industries, which is not how we typically think about labor coming from the South. Do you imagine that that's a possibility, even though you just said right now, I don't think we have the situation in place, but that would mean are universities exchanging more? Obviously, we do the best we can. But could labor be redefined in a way that was beneficial to both sides?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have to tell you that some of the border states, again, because these are the states we're talking about: Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Nuevo Leon, those kind of border states that have 60 years of enormous experience in integrating themselves into the U.S. manufacturing chain. I mean, very successful
Hmm. Hmm.
places like Tijuana and Juarez and Nogales and Matamoros and many different places in Mexico. They're very successful in attracting increasingly more sophisticated manufacture. The kinds of things that can be built in Mexico, that can be
Hmm.
built there, and then exported to the U.S. market. And then, of course, then the U.S. benefits from lower labor costs, and it also benefits from proximity. I mean, the whole nearshoring word is based on near, being
Right.
near,
Right.
and it's also more sustainable because you're a
Hmm.
lot closer. You don't have to spend as much effort, energy, time in transporting things all the way from Asia and
Hmm.
things like that. So there's things that we can do so that labor doesn't necessarily mean that Mexicans have to be here or Americans have to be there. There's a lot of
Mm,
work that can be done there as
right.
well. There's a lot of people that can, you know, with the nomads, the technological nomads, we've discovered that many of them now live in Mexico City, but
Hmm.
work in some company in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And many Mexicans could offer services. There's a lot of call centers showing up in Mexico, especially because a lot of the deported individuals that grew up in the United States or speak English, could potentially work in those call centers and things like that. That's not greatly sophisticated labor, but you can imagine it evolving in such a way that work doesn't have to be in a particular place. It can be in many different places. I was just looking at a particular article on Mexican doctors being certified to
Hmm.
serve underserved communities in the United States, and this can
Right.
be done on the computer. It can be done in person. It can be done hybrid, part-time here and part-time on the computer to follow up with the clients. There's many, many different ways in which we could actually work and benefit each other. It is really about the environment that is just not quite right uh,
Yeah.
at this point in time. Yeah.
So I want to bring this conversation to conclusion, which has been really dynamic, and I really appreciate again, Tony, your clarity and the way that you have enunciated the challenges. I'm sure, because you said it as well, this is a difficult time for Mexico, and I wish I had better news. And I'm sure people want to hear better news from you. You give a lot of reports, you speak frequently about all these issues, but you give us a number of reasons to say, yeah, there's room for optimism here, but it's going to take a whole lot of work. How do you present the challenging circumstances to Mexico to audiences that want to believe that better days are ahead and here's the way we get to them, when you suggested to some degree a lot of those avenues that you would normally take may not be available? How do you present that story to come out the other side with people feeling we can make something better happen here?
Yeah, look, this is a challenging question as well, because I think it's a question that I ask myself increasingly more so. And of course, when I interact with my colleagues here at the U.S. Mexico Center, we always say, oh, let me put it this way: I have a patron, somebody who contributes money, and he loves to talk to me because I think he gets a lot of the information and analysis that he needs to hear. But he says, but I wouldn't bring my clients and present them to
Right,
you
right. I
before you,
get that.
because they run away and say, I don't want to hear anything about that. Uh,
Exactly.
but hearing from him and other folks also gives me a lot of hope. I
Mm,
think that policymakers is one thing. Politicians is a different thing. Ideologues is a different thing. But down below that,
mhm.
companies are doing business, exports are growing, people are moving. If you look at the use of the TN visa, 33,000 Mexicans now use TN visas to work in the United States in all kinds of professions. Uh, Mexicans continue to travel and do tourism in the United States. Americans continue to go to Mexico and live in Mexico and work in Mexico. Exports continue to come and go. 50% of the $800 billion trade relationship is intra-firm trade. What does
Hmm.
that mean? It means that a company is buying certain parts in the United States to finish the product in Mexico, to bring it back, to
Right.
take it back and bring it back, and then this it tells you how integrated these supply chains are. The rest of it, the other 50% or so, are consumer goods, stuff
Hmm.
that is already
Hmm.
finished,
Hmm.
and we import, export, and then it's ready to use. But a lot of it is just parts and services
Right.
and things like that. So that tells you how integrated the two countries are. And I also think that when you look further down into public opinion, more and more Americans are saying that Mexico is a strategic ally, a friend, and I think Mexicans have demonstrated that they're a
Hmm.
great asset to the United States. We're talking 38 to
Hmm.
40 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans,
Hmm.
hard earned place in American society. But now, this old image that, when I was growing up in the 80s, and the 70s and 80s, and I was a kid, this image of a lazy Mexican underneath a saguaro,
Yeah.
with the sombrero taking a siesta. That is not the image of a Mexican today. It's that of a professional, an entrepreneur, a business
Yeah.
starter, somebody who's really up and coming. And of course, a lot of Americans are beginning to understand that Mexico is complex, but it's strategic to the United States in a more uncertain world. So underneath that, our pessimism, I think there's a lot of good stories. And the other thing that I want to do in the center is go to the governors and the mayors, because I
Mm,
think that
mm,
our federal politicians are one thing; they're opportunistic. They understand how to use rhetoric and how to use negativity and things like that. But when you talk to the mayor of Chihuahua City, when you talk to the
yes,
mayor of Hermosillo, when you talk to the governor of Querétaro, when you talk to the governor of Yucatan, to Silicon Valley being developed in Guadalajara, to the incredible manufacturing in Monterrey and things like that, when you talk to those kinds of level leaders,
yes.
you realize, wow, the potential for this relationship is really astonishing. We just need to see how that local can trickle to the federal, because that's where our worst, I think,
Yes.
politicians are on both sides.
I think the closer you are, which is why I'm a big fan of working with cities, where ideas can be operationalized, they can be made manifest, real, new things are being produced. You're creating communities in a different way. When you have that kind of proximity between the decision making and the outcome, you see people get real. I think the more abstract it gets at the federal level or elsewhere, the more difficult it can be. Tony, this has been a fantastic conversation. You're very generous with your time and your thoughts, and we just really, really appreciate it. Thank you so
Well,
much.
happy to be here, Duke, and thank you to your team, and thanks for the invitation. Anytime, I'll be here.